So, Professor, I know we've talked about some things that your research interests are. Kind of want to begin the podcast with a little bit of a small anecdote of kind of how I've recently come into contact with what people know about these things you study. So, at the beginning of my grad career, I TA'd for the first part of U.S. history, and so it was kind of cool seeing kind of what the higher level view of that event is. And at the same time, too, we had gotten to the part where we started talking about the Civil War and the after effects of that event as well. And so I was having a conversation with one of my roommates at the time. I think he was a junior studying engineering, I believe. And so I was talking about the Civil War with him, and he basically said to me like, "Oh yeah, like slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War. Like it was all kind of like a separate thing." I was like, "What? Are you kidding me?" So I'm trying to tell him like all these things, like, of all like the different compromises that occurred over slavery, the fact that like the Emancipation Proclamation happened within the same event, like just trying to get him to have him understand this idea that that's a big part thing that's you're missing essentially. But I didn't push him too much because I didn't want to piss him off and have a bad roommate vibes or whatever. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that like it's really interesting that this is still like a problem and something that people don't really understand. So just to
I'm
kind
going
of
to jump in real quick here.
Go for it.
Every single state's articles of secession also directly stated that they were leaving due to slavery.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you look at any historical documentation, it makes zero sense that there's an argument against it.
So hopefully we can, through our conversations, we kind of come to understand why that's the case, why people have that misunderstanding. And so just to kind of begin the question, you can kind of react to what I just said, but to this question as well, what is introduction and why do you think it's important time in U.S. history to kind of understand?
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? Do you remember where your roommate was from?
He was from New York.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Upstate New York, yeah.
Yeah, upstate. So there are a lot of I do ask students at Davis, and I there's a lot of I grew up partly in Kentucky and Tennessee. There's a lot of taught in New York City. There's a lot of variation across the country in how people would answer that question of was the Civil War about slavery. It's strongest among white Southerners, the denial that it was about slavery. But there's a really strong number of students at Davis. Anecdotally, it seems to me, especially those who are from the Valley, who were taught in school that it was not, that it was about something else. And it seems to me less so among some of the students from the coast, though that's a really broad generalization. And many of the students, report that and report it as they know that it was wrong, but it is what they were taught. So, I'm not speaking about them, but about the ways it's kept its hold. So in other words, one possibility is that your roommate, just had particularly, roommates can think all kinds of things. And some of them tell us a lot of things about the world.
Of course.
And some of us tell them some things about their roommate. And I don't have any comment on your roommate, but I do think it is interesting to reflect on how many people, how much your roommate might represent a pretty large block. Declining, but still a very large block. So from U.S. history is really shaped by many things, but among the central tensions of how we understand U.S. history are the gap between what Daniel said and what you said. The historical record is really clear, and yet a lot of people don't believe it. So that, and sometimes that happens on relatively minor things, but this is a big deal, right? This is one of the formative events in U.S. history, and more with roughly 720,000 ish deaths, more than most of our other wars combined. Transforms the Constitution, of course, the emancipation of 4 million people. So all kinds of things seem to ride on it in our popular memory, and yet our popular memory is often really wrong. So there's a lot of reasons for this, one of which is that two kind of forms of amnesia. The first and the most consistent in U.S. history is amnesia about the role of African Americans. So certainly I think most white Southerners are highly attuned to the existence of African Americans, but amnesiac about their role as actors rather than as acted upon. And that's broader theme of U.S. history, that it's been often, sort of this repeated portrayal of history as something that happens to African Americans, not by and through. And in that context, forgetting the centrality of slavery, which can mean forgetting the importance of slavery to the economy, or it can mean forgetting the ways that enslaved people took action, both to undermine slavery and to join forces with the U.S. in the Civil War, and 180,000 in uniform of the U.S. Army, another 20,000 or so in the Navy. And then hundreds of other thousands go into U.S. lines to break down slavery and to bring the Confederacy to its knees. So that's been one big form of amnesia. And that's an amnesia built into that goes back to the slave owners themselves, who lived in this kind of contradiction. They recognized their enslaved people were people who had, regular human reactions. They didn't think they were equal, but they, we sometimes say they thought of them as beasts. That's actually something we tell ourselves, because we want to think that if they saw them as people, they wouldn't do this to them. But in fact, history is full of people who see other people as people and treat them, monstrously. So that's about us. They very often did refer to them as people, not as equal. And they understood, the sort of range of human emotions, but they also practiced a kind of denial that enslaved people would ever revolt, that they, could do something more, that they wanted to do something more. And this denial was very profound in white Southern society. So that's one part, and probably the most significant part of the amnesia. And the most significant thing that scholars, starting with people like George Washington Williams, who was a Black U.S. veteran and politician and Civil War veteran, who began to compile these early records of Black service in first the Revolutionary War and in the Civil War period. And then throughout the 20th century, history first centered in African American scholars and then slowly broadening out in the academy of what role are Black people playing and how are they not only recipients of history, but creators of history. That's one big form of amnesia, and something history brings, but that's very hard to get through to popular consciousness. So it's changing, it's shifting. The second is odder, which is an amnesia about the idea that the North meant it. And this is weird because the first part, if you look from a satellite, image and said, here's a nation where you've got a population, of in the teens, of 20% or less, that is treated, completely unequally. How is that society going to deal with their history? You could actually make a lot of predictions going forward, right? About the absence. But if you said, and in this society, one of the largest groups fought a successful war that destroyed that institution, do you think they celebrate it or not? You would say, well, of course they do, right? In fact, you would expect that the history of the United States would be told as if we didn't know anything, our amnesia was about the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And that we lived in a kind of triumphalism of the Union. And it's weird in certain ways that didn't happen. Not just in the South, but even in the North. Now, certainly in the years after the war, there is absolutely, if you read through this kind of Northern triumphalism, they won because they were virtuous. And they didn't mind saying it. That faded. In part, it faded because that generation of veterans died off. And their children were much less eager to say the Confederates were evil. Part it happened because of disfranchisement of African Americans. So Northern Republican politicians were no longer in an alliance with Southern African American politicians, where they, got reminded of this centrality. Part of it is the early 20th century. We can kind of sometimes convince ourselves either that racism is something that started terrible and gets better, or it's something that's a flat line. It never changes. But in fact, it's like other parts of history, it resists both of those narratives. And one of the oddities is that the early 1900s culturally seems a much more widespread racist moment than the, say, 1870s. And so that many white Northerners catch that. By the early 20th century, we think of a kind of reconciliation project in which the deals of creating a national framework for understanding a expanding U.S. nation and the relationship of the Civil War to it involves white Southerners no longer saying the Confederacy should have won, and white Northerners acknowledging that the Confederacy wasn't completely evil. And that meant Black people disappearing. And so over the course of the US, mostly after the Civil War veterans are dying off, you see US textbooks, and even in northern states, starting to kind of emerge into this consensus. They didn't teach that the Confederacy was right or secession was right. They're nationalists. But they did teach that it was an honorable part of US history. And to teach that, they had to make not only African Americans disappear, but also the reason for the war disappear. And that meant, weirdly, we also lost touch of something you would think that, white Northerners would celebrate, that they were on the right side. And that over time got either faded into just they were nationalists, or it was just this thing that mysteriously happened. And then everybody, acted in the face of a seemingly meaningless conflict. And what's interesting is that once it's unleashed, ideas spread all over the place. So once this gets out there through NeoConfederates. And this oddity that people who said, Alexander Stephens says in 1861, slavery and white supremacy is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. 1867 to 68, after the war, he's publishing books that say the Civil War was about a constitutional disagreement and slavery was just incidental. The same people, they realize that once slavery is dead, they can no longer claim on the court of public opinion that it was about slavery. They start saying, well, slavery would have died anyway. It was some other higher principle. And what you see then is that amnesia coming out. At first, when they introduced this idea, white Northerners really resisted and resented. But over the early 20th century, it really spreads. And I'll finish with one last anecdote and let you go to your next question. Probably the greatest, or one of the two greatest Reconstruction historians, Eric Foner, grew up on Long Island, New York. And he retells a story. And he grew up in a family that was highly committed because they were tied to Communist Party related organizations. He knew Paul Robeson held him on his shoulders. He knew W.B. Du Bois, the other truly great Reconstruction historian. And Foner's family moved out to Long Island. He goes to a high school where they're taught that the Civil War wasn't about slavery and Reconstruction was a mistake. And young Eric Foner, this is probably in the early 50s, goes to his teacher and says, that's not really how I see it. I mean, he knew W.B. Du Bois, right? He was aware of other possibilities. To her credit, the teacher says, why don't you teach it your way and let's see what the class thinks. So he goes in, prepares his lecture. His father and his uncle were both history professors. He had other uncles in trade unions and so on. They gives his talk to the class. And the teacher says, so now you've heard two sides. Let's take a vote. Which side do you agree with? And the tallies came back and it was 27-2 for the teacher.
Oh, wow.
Eric walks out. This is in New York. This is not in Alabama. Eric walks out and his best friend comes behind him and says, hey, I didn't agree with you either, but I didn't want you to be all alone, so I voted for you. So he convinced nobody, which is to say that, yes, it emerges from the white South, but it's really peculiar how much the white North, even though this other model existed out there, what they called the treasury of virtue, the idea of the virtuous North, really gets subsumed even in the North. And that makes the Civil War kind of meaningless or just a way of reading character.
Yeah, and so I think that brings up a lot of great points, and especially reading some of your work on Reconstruction, I can maybe see where that maybe that amnesia could have came from, and I think that's something we can talk about next.